What's the one thing more interesting than a convoluted heist? A complicated prison escape. Since the dawn of incarceration, we have been obsessed with the idea of breaking out of jails, the unique strategies and unconventional approaches required to breach walls and escape confinement designed to keep you locked in. You would think it would be almost impossible to break out of somewhere with near 24-hour surveillance, armed guards, trapped by iron bars and concrete walls, but it's been done many times at this point, sometimes with methods so simple you would think they would never have worked at all, and some so complicated and intricate, you wonder how these prisoners were even able to come up with, much less hatch, these bizarre schemes. From the peanut butter prison escape, to underground tunnels, makeshift boats, dummies, and ladders, to escape artists who have broken out over 5 times, this is the infamous prison escapes Iceberg, explained. El Chapo. Possibly the most well-known and infamous criminal to have escaped prison in recent memory is Joaquin Archibaldo Guzman Loera, aka El Chapo, Mexican drug lord and former leader of the Sinaloa cartel, at his peak the most influential and powerful drug lord the world has ever seen. El Chapo escaped prison twice in Mexico, before eventually being extradited to the United States, where he is serving his life sentence today at ADX Florence, the most secure supermax prison in America, known under the nickname of the Alcatraz of the Rockies. It's unlikely he will ever see the outside of this prison ever again. Back in 1993, he was arrested for the first time at a hotel near the Guatemala-Mexico border, and would receive a sentence of 20 years, 9 months, being relocated to a prison known as Puente Grande. From here, his drug empire still ran smoothly, as he was able to bribe prison officials and still run things from inside, giving orders to his followers. However, the one thing he did fear while in jail was extradition to the United States, which looked more and more likely by the day, as El Chapo was indicted in the US while still in prison, on charges of money laundering and drug trafficking. Knowing he would face a much harsher prison sentence in the US, on January 19, 2001, El Chapo escaped the prison by bribing a guard into opening his cell door. From there, he simply got into a laundry cart, which a maintenance worker then rolled out the front door, and into the truck of a car, where he was transported out of the city. Over 70 people were eventually implicated as being involved with this first escape. He would be arrested again in 2014 at a different hotel in Jalisco via a joint operation between the Mexican police, DEA, Mexican Navy, and US Marshals. Guzman was taken to Federal Social Readaptation Center No. 1, as it was called, to serve out the remainder of his sentence. He would escape only about a year later, in July of 2015. This is where the infamous tunnel under the prison was discovered. After he had not been seen on the cameras for over 20 minutes, the guards went to check up on him, only to discover that he was gone and had escaped underneath the shower area, 33 feet underground, and going almost a mile away, leading to a construction site. A motorcycle was also found, likely as a method of quickly getting from one side of the tunnel to the other, and just like that, the most dangerous and infamous drug lord in Mexico's history escaped prison twice, but he would not get so lucky a third time. Interestingly enough, he was almost caught again after having a meeting with actor Sean Penn and actress Kate Del Castillo, leading to a raid on a ranch where he was staying at, although he was able to evade the authorities this time. It wouldn't last long though, as thanks to a joint operation between Mexican and American forces, known as Operation Black Swan, on January 8, 2016, El Chapo was arrested again, but not before escaping via a different tunnel, only to be discovered yet again at a nearby town. At this point, he was finally extradited to the United States, where he has remained since, serving a life sentence. The Texas Seven. The Texas Seven is a name given to a group of prisoners that all managed to escape from the John B. Connolly Unit, a maximum security prison, on December 13, 2000, near Kennedy, Texas. This was one of the most high-profile escapes in American history, leading to a massive manhunt and the eventual capture of all but one of the men. This group was made of the worst, many of them convicted of crimes unspeakable. The members were Joseph Garcia, Randy Ethan Halprin, Larry Harper, Patrick Murphy Jr., Donald Newberry, George Rivas Jr., and Michael Rodriguez. They were all serving hard time and agreed to break out under the leadership of George Rivas. Their approach wasn't very tactful, but to their credit, still worked. Using their strength in numbers, they were able to overpower the guards one by one in the electrical room, tying them up and taking their uniforms. They disguised themselves as civilian workers and guards, and made their way to the control room and guard tower to subdue their last remaining obstacles in the escape. From here, they simply got into a truck and took with them multiple guns they had stolen, and drove right through the front gate. Unfortunately, however, this is not where their spree of violence ends. A few days later, the group, under aliases, checked into a motel and robbed a nearby Sports Authority store, tying up civilians and the staff, stealing guns and money from the safe. A concerned citizen noticed the commotion and called the police. Officer Aubrey Hawkins answered the call and entered the store, only to be gunned down by the crew, who then made their getaway. Following this brazen robbery and murder of a police officer after their already brash escape from prison, America's Most Wanted aired an episode about the crew on January 20th, 2001. It wouldn't take long for people to recognize them. 5 of the crew was found at an RV park in El Paso. Larry Harper took his own life, while Rivas, Rodriguez, Garcia, and Halprin were all arrested. The last 2, Patrick Murphy and Donald Newberry, were arrested on January 23rd at a motel in Colorado. The surviving members of the Texas 7 were all sentenced to death, with 4 of the 6 having been executed as of making this video. John Dillinger. John Dillinger was one of the most infamous criminals and gangsters of the Great Depression era. He ran a violent crew of bank robbers known as the Dillinger Gang, responsible for as many as 24 robberies and for the deaths of at least 10 people, including a police officer, as well as 3 jailbreaks, all this occurring over the course of only 1 year, from June 21st, 1933 to June 30th, 1934. The first time he broke out was following his first few bank robberies in the summer of 1933. He was arrested by police and transferred to Allen County Jail in Lima, Ohio. Dillinger was already planning to break out members of his gang, with the guards even confiscating what looked to be a prison escape plan that they couldn't decipher, one that Dillinger refused to explain. He was able to get friends to smuggle weapons into the cells of his gang members, who used them to escape from their confinement 4 days after Dillinger's capture. The men then returned the favor by coming from Indiana, impersonating police officers, and breaking Dillinger out by claiming they were there to extradite him to Indiana for a different crime. When the sheriff, Jess Sarber, became suspicious and asked for identification from the men, he was shot and killed. From there, the 4 men made their escape back to Indiana and continued their bender of crimes. His second jail escape came in early 1934, after his gang was captured in Arizona following a bank robbery in Chicago, which left a police officer, William O'Malley, dead. Dillinger was taken to Lake County Jail in Crown Point, Indiana, where he escaped on March 3, 1934, a feat which was deemed impossible as the jail was stated to be escape-proof. He proved them wrong though when he pulled out a fake pistol carved from wood during exercise and used it to take hostages and free himself from the jail. He would then continue his spree of crimes, narrowly escaping capture on a few different occasions, and eventually deciding he wanted to live under a different name and chose to pursue cosmetic surgery to alter his appearance. This didn't work, however, as a woman named Ana Campañas was able to identify Dillinger to the FBI. He was subsequently found and shot dead while exiting a movie theater on July 22, 1934. Frank Abagnale. You probably recognize this name as the main character of the American crime film from 2002, Catch Me If You Can, starring Leonardo DiCaprio playing the role of the young con man, adapted from his autobiography of the same name, written in 1980, which details his life and many alleged schemes and frauds. Some of these claims have since been disputed and are of dubious veracity. He claims to have pretended to be a doctor in Georgia, worked as an assistant state attorney general in Louisiana, and even impersonated a pilot at Pan American World Airways, among a slew of other frauds and alleged criminal activities. He was eventually arrested in France in 1969 for auto theft and served 4 months in prison before being extradited to Sweden, where he served an additional 2 months for fraud and forgery, and was also banned from the country before being returned to the United States in 1970. He caught the attention of the FBI and was arrested that same year in Georgia after cashing in fake checks from Pan Am Airways. He was taken to Cobb County Jail, known as the Adult Detention Center. He claims to have escaped the jail by, once again, impersonation, pretending to be an undercover prison inspector. Again, this may or not actually be the case. The story could definitely be exaggerated, so take it with a grain of salt. Allegedly, though, the guards fell for this ruse and gave him special privileges not granted to normal inmates, such as additional phone time, as well as the ability to wear street clothes and not the standard prison jumpsuit. He was then able to enlist the help of an accomplice to pretend to be a prison inspector and an FBI agent to further corroborate his story to the prison officials. From here, he claimed that he urgently needed to meet with this FBI agent to discuss something and had to be escorted out of the prison. He told the guards to call the number on a business card, which was actually just his accomplice, who confirmed his story, and allegedly, he was walked right out of the jail and directly to the car of his accomplice. This didn't last long though, as he was caught just 4 days later in New York. Whoops. In 1971, he was ultimately sentenced to 10 years for forging the checks and 2 years for the escape, although he would be released on parole in 1974, only serving about 2 years of his sentence. He was then able to become a security consultant due to his knowledge of fraud schemes, and claims to have worked with banks, police departments, and even the FBI. There are additional unverified claims of escaping from custody, including from the JFK airport in New York back in 1978 through the toilet of an aircraft, landing directly onto the runway and taking off, running until he found a cab and was able to escape the FBI. A story which the Bureau has never corroborated. Alcatraz escape. No doubt one of the most well-known escape attempts, thanks to it taking place at one of the world's most notorious prisons, Alcatraz Island, known for being one of the most harsh, brutal, and inescapable penitentiaries in the history of the United States prison system. In fact, no one has ever been confirmed to have escaped Alcatraz alive, but if anyone actually did, it would be Frank Lee Morris and the Anglin brothers, Clarence and John. This is one of the most interesting cases, not just because they managed to break out of what was once considered to be an inescapable prison, but also because we don't know if they made it out of the water and actually got away. Most experts today believe they drowned in the frigid waters, but many choose to believe that they made it to their goal destination of Angel Island and eventually got away, never to be seen again. There are even some reported sightings of the men after this point, although none of these could be verified. The FBI has since closed the file in 1979, saying they likely drowned before ever reaching Angel Island. But let's back up. The ringleader, Frank Lee Morris, was in for burglary and a previous escape from a different prison. He was said to have an IQ of 133. In Alcatraz, he met the criminal duo, brothers John and Clarence Anglin, and another prisoner named Alan West, who was also a would-be escape artist. Together, they hatched an insane plan to escape the rock. They began by chipping away at a vent below the sink in their cells, using various makeshift tools and pieces of metal, most famously spoons from the cafeteria. They would then cover this hole with painted cardboard to look like the vent cover. From here, after months of digging, they were able to enter a utility corridor which led up to the roof through a vacant top cell block, which luckily for them was unguarded, and at the top was a large fan that led directly onto the roof. Before they made their escape though, they needed a way off the island, and some way to avoid being noticed that they had left their cells, so they started making papier-mâché dummy heads that resembled themselves. Using hair from the barber and paint from the workshop, they were able to make some pretty realistic looking heads that would leave guards none the wiser until morning. As for getting off the island, they knew they couldn't swim a mile to the nearby Angel Island. They needed some sort of makeshift raft, which they created using raincoats and other supplies from the workshop. Everything seemed to be going to plan on the night of June 11th, 1962, when they started their escape. Everything except that West had failed to meet them in the utility shaft on time, so the other three ended up leaving him behind, making their way up to the roof and getting down to the shore without being seen, descending over 50 feet down the building and scaling barbed wire fences. From here, they were able to inflate their makeshift raft using an accordion and made their way towards Angel Island, only to never be seen again, making this escape all the more fascinating and mysterious. Various personal effects and escape equipment were recovered from the waters nearby, though no trace of the men themselves were ever located. The FBI concluded the odds of them reaching Angel Island, let alone getting back to the mainland, were slim if not negligible. Yoshie Shiratori. Out of all the people on Earth to have ever escaped prison, I think Yoshie Shiratori might just be the most successful prison escape artist of all time, and let me explain why if you haven't heard his story, because it's absolutely insane. While a lot of bold claims can be made by a lot of these prisoners about their many daring escapes and escapades, most of them cannot actually be proven, but that isn't really the case with Yoshie Shiratori, as he does have at least 4 different documented escapes on record, each one crazier than the last. His story starts in 1936, when he is taken to Aomori Prison facing a murder charge and possibly the death penalty. Shiratori studied the routine of the guards and found a small window between patrols in which he believed he could escape. Using a piece of metal taken from one of the buckets in the prison bathhouse, he was able to pick the lock of his cell, and like the Alcatraz trio, had a dummy in his bed to give him some extra time to escape, made simply from the floorboards. This gave him the time to pick additional gates and make his way through a skylight and out of the prison, where his escape wouldn't be discovered until the next morning. It's clear that while escaping seems to be his strong suit, staying out of custody was not, as Shiratori was picked up about 3 days later while trying to steal supplies from a hospital. He was subsequently sentenced to life and was taken to Akita Prison in 1941, where his second breakout would occur. The conditions of Shiratori's confinement were grave and meant specifically to deter him from attempting another escape, and made it, you would think, an impossible task. His small cell had an incredibly high ceiling, up to only one small skylight, surrounded by smooth copper walls, which would not be easily grippable. Needless to say, this one would be a lot more tricky, at least at first glance. His solitary confinement and specially crafted escape artist-proof cell actually gave him the time to loosen the skylight above each night, damaging the wood holding the frame over time, as the unclimbable walls were in fact not a challenge for Shiratori, who was able to scale them night after night, until finally, in the late hours of June 14th, 1942, during a loud storm, Shiratori activated his escape plan, scaled the room and kicked open the skylight, freeing himself onto the roof, where he then, under the noise of the storm, was able to sneak his way across the roof and climb the walls of the prison and escape undetected. This time he was on the lam for about 3 months, when Shiratori made a grave error in his attempts to stay out of police custody. He visited one of the prison guards who had been kind to him during his imprisonment in Akita. The guard, Kobayashi, notified the authorities, and Shiratori was once again arrested. Despite how smart and cunning of an escape artist he is, it appears that for some reason he's either too trusting of other people, or somewhere, maybe deep down, wanted to be caught. Either way, this time he would be taken to an even more brutal prison with even harsher anti-escape practices to ensure Shiratori wasn't going anywhere. He was transferred in 1943 to Abashiri Prison. The temperatures were unbearably cold in northern Hokkaido, where the facility was located, and Shiratori was placed in an open cell, exposed to the elements at all times, and even beaten on regular occasion by the prison guards. He was also placed in special handcuffs, which could only be opened by a specialist, and were only removed for him to bathe once per week. It seemed there was no chance of Shiratori breaking out this time, but somehow, yet again, he defies all odds. Over the course of months, he would take his miso soup portion of his meal, given to him daily, and put some of it on the food slot of his cell door and onto his handcuffs, slowly loosening the bolts over time. After this, he was able to remove the covering on the food slot opening and get out of his handcuffs, but the prison officials had seen this coming and made the opening too small for any man to fit through, at least in normal circumstances, as Shiratori was able to dislocate both of his shoulders and fit through the small opening and escape through a skylight on the ceiling on August 16th, 1944. From here, Shiratori would live for 2 years in isolation in an abandoned mine before finding out about the end of World War II and Japan's surrender. From here, he would make his way south to the city of Sapporo, where he would then end up killing a farmer while trying to steal a tomato from his farm, which would lead to his arrest yet again. This time, due to the numerous escapes and now murder on his rap sheet, he was given the death penalty. This time he was taken to Sapporo prison. Once again, he was given a specially designed, escape-proof cell with no openings big enough to escape through. In fact, the guards were so cocky, they didn't even bother handcuffing him because the windows were even smaller than his head. It was impossible for him to escape, as he previously did. That's why this time he took a different approach and simply removed the floorboards in his cell and dug a tunnel underneath the prison for a month straight, using a miso soup bowl. But this was his last escape. According to legend, after a month on the run after his latest breakout, Shiratori broke down and admitted to being an escaped convict to a police officer after the man offered him a cigarette. His case was reevaluated, and it was deemed that the attack on the farmer was self-defense rather than murder, and he was just sentenced to 20 years for his escapes. He claimed that all these escapes were not done to be free, but as a protest against the corrupt guards who were mistreating prisoners, and agreed to serve his time if he was treated fairly, which he actually did, eventually being released on parole after serving 14 years in Fuchu prison. Brian Bo Larson. This guy isn't as well known and kind of hard to find information on. Mainly, he is known for his Danish prison escapes and likely exaggerated claims of having escaped confinement a total of 22 times over the course of his life between the years of 1989 and 2014. While this is likely a tall tale, he is confirmed to have broken out of jail at least once. He allegedly escaped through pretty much every method possible, starting in 1995 when reportedly someone broke through the prison walls with a stolen bulldozer. He is also said to have escaped jail in 2005 by hiding inside of a container to be disposed of by a waste collection service. His most well-known and documented escape, and the only one that can be verified, was in 2014 from Vridsløselil prison in Copenhagen, Denmark. It was a rather simple plan, but it worked. He used a hacksaw he smuggled into his cell to saw off the bars, and then exited his cell, reached the roof of the prison, and descended using a rope. He was arrested again shortly after this latest attempt, and as far as I know hasn't attempted another escape, possibly because most of these stories about the so-called Escape King were made up, or at the very least, highly exaggerated, which to be fair is the case for a lot of these prisoners. Richard Matt and David Sweat. Now known as the 2015 Clinton Correctional Facility escape, this jailbreak involved inmates Richard Matt, a career criminal with a slew of offenses, including a second-degree murder conviction, and David Sweat, who murdered a sheriff's deputy while transporting stolen firearms. Suffice to say, they were not getting out anytime soon, at least through the proper channels. Sweat was given a life sentence without the possibility of parole, and Matt was given 25 years to life. Their elaborate escape has not only been compared to the one found in the famous and well-regarded prison drama The Shawshank Redemption, but was also the subject of its own story adaptation called Escape at Dannemora, a television miniseries directed by Ben Stiller, starring Paul Dano as Sweat and Benicio del Toro as Matt. Anyways, the two began their plan by cozying up to a prison employee named Joyce Mitchell, who they convinced to help them escape, after getting her to fall in love with them, and urged her to not only help them escape and flee with them, but also kill her own husband. They also somehow duped another prison guard, Gene Palmer, into smuggling in supplies for them to aid in their plans. In fact, it wasn't just these two they had tricked. They had been given special privileges due to good behavior, and were housed in the so-called honor block, and were allowed to use TVs, phones, and cooking stations during the day, which aided them in their escape efforts. They smuggled tools into their cells at night to dig through them into a maintenance corridor which was unprotected, before returning the tools during the day so no one would know what they were up to. Eventually, after many nights digging through the walls and cutting through steel piping, navigating their way through the long tunnels, they made it to a manhole cover leading outside of the prison walls, which they used to escape on the night of June 5th, 2015. However, Joyce Mitchell neglected to show up as the getaway driver as planned, leading Matt and Sweat to take off on foot and triggering a huge nationwide manhunt for the two fugitives. At some point, Matt and Sweat had split up. On June 26th, Matt was seen shooting at a car with a shotgun and was shot and killed in a confrontation with a Border Patrol agent named Chris Voss outside of Malone, New York. 2 days later, about 16 miles away, Sweat was spotted by a state trooper named Jay Cook, who recognized the fugitive and chased him down, firing 2 shots to subdue him, hitting him in the right shoulder and left arm before arresting him. He is currently incarcerated at a maximum security prison in upstate New York, serving his life sentence. Alfred Hines. Here we have another infamous escapee and repeat offender, Alfred George Hines, later known in the press as Houdini Hines for his escaping abilities. Strangely enough, he was only serving a 12-year sentence for robbery when he first decided to break out. Now yes, 12 years is a long time, but it's not 30. It's not a life sentence. You should just be able to wait it out. Maybe apply for appeals, parole, something. Be a model prisoner in the downtime, but I guess this guy was just impatient. And guess what? It all worked out for him, so what do I know? His first escape came in November of 1955 at Nottingham Prison. With the help of another inmate, Patrick Fleming, they were able to create a duplicate key to the carpentry workshop, which they accessed at night, waiting for the right moment, and then created a makeshift ladder out of various wooden pieces, using it to scale a 20-foot wall and then a fence. Hines was arrested less than a year later in Dublin. His next escape would come in 1957, when he planned and executed an insane but brilliant scheme. He had court appearances due to him filing a lawsuit against the prison. The only time his handcuffs would come off was when he would go to the bathroom. He then used this opportunity to have a padlock smuggled in, and then used it to lock the guards assigned to him inside a cubicle as he came out of the bathroom. From here, it was as simple as walking out of the courthouse and into the street crowds. This escape did not last long, however, as he was apprehended that same day, just a few hours later, attempting to flee at the London airport. His final escape occurred not even a year later at the high-security facility Chelmsford Prison in 1958. Not much is known about this particular breakout, except that it once again involved making duplicate keys, but again he was ultimately recaptured 2 years later, living in Belfast, Ireland, under an assumed alias. He became quite famous and somewhat of a celebrity in Great Britain after his various exploits, writing a book about his struggles with the legal system and even winning a lawsuit against his arresting officer of the Scotland Yard. And like Frank Abagnale, Hines claims to have become a consultant for the UK's justice system and also a public speaker. The Great Escape. The Great Escape, as it's known, is anything but a typical prison escape. It is the nickname given to a breakout of Allied soldiers held in a German POW camp during World War II, which is also the subject of a fictionalized account in the film of the same name from 1963. The camp was called Stalag Luft III and was the subject of another separate escape in 1943, which involved a tunnel dug near the fence. In this plan, only 3 men were able to get out. With the Great Escape conceived by Roger Bushell, many more would be able to escape. Since this involved hundreds of soldiers and months of careful planning, the tunnels were massive and 30 feet underground, all dug without alerting the guards. They even created lighting and ventilation systems to help them as they continued creating their 3 tunnels, which they made at the same time in case one was ever discovered. Guards wouldn't be likely to think that 2 more were also being worked on. This whole thing was incredibly risky, involving such a complex operation with so many moving parts and so many soldiers involved. All it would take is one guy to squeal and it was all over. Roger forbade anyone from even saying the word tunnel, and instead referred to the 3 different tunnels under code names of Tom, Dick, and Harry. The 3 tunnel strategy ended up being very necessary, as Tom was found by the Germans and destroyed by dynamite, and Dick was also abandoned as an escape route when they realized the tunnel would lead to an area that the camp was expanding into, which wouldn't give them enough space to get away easily. That left Harry as the final tunnel and the only way out. The tunnel was actually discovered in the middle of the escape, so only 76 of the over 200 would-be escapees made it out, but that is still quite a feat in itself. Of the 76 that got out though, only 3 were able to get away without being recaptured, with many of those who got reapprehended being executed. Again, if you want a better retelling of this story, the Great Escape movie from 1963 does a great job. Pascal Payette. Pascal Payette is an interesting character with an even more interesting record, the most escapes by helicopter. He was born in Montpellier, France in 1963, and was in and out of jail since 1988, until he was hit with his biggest conviction yet. On November 20th, 1997, he was involved in an armored car heist gone wrong, which involved the death of one of the guards, leading to his arrest in '99 and receiving a sentence of 30 years for the robbery and murder. He didn't plan on staying at the prison in Luynes very long though, because on October 12th, 2001, with the help of an accomplice, Frederick Impoko, he was able to get out of the prison via a hijacked helicopter. And no, I'm not making this up, even though it does sound like a GTA Online mission. And this isn't even the only time he did this. He then, 2 years later, in April of 2003, planned and executed the same escape plan on the same exact prison to bust out some of his friends. This would definitely come back to bite him though, as he would be arrested for this breakout less than a month later, adding an additional 7 years for that one, and 6 for his own escape in 2001. By this point, Payette was considered one of the most closely guarded prisoners in all of France, known for his habit and talent for escaping. He was never kept in the same prison for more than 6 months, and was consistently under surveillance and placed in solitary confinement often, but that did not stop him from getting out a 3rd time. Take a guess how he did it. On July 14th, 2007, taking advantage of the holiday Bastille Day, he once again had some accomplices steal a helicopter, forcing the pilot to fly them, this time taken from a nearby airport, and used it to free Payette from his solitary confinement at Grasse prison. The helicopter and the pilot were then left on the southern coast of France, and the prisoner and his liberators fled the country. Eventually he was caught again in September of that year, hiding out in Barcelona, Spain. He was then extradited back to France and was kept in unknown prisons for security reasons, so as not to give him any way of contacting anyone on the outside to help in another crazy helicopter escape. He was sentenced to 15 years and an additional 5 for his escape in 2007, but surprisingly was actually paroled in 2019 and walks today as a free man. Maze Prison. The escape from Maze Prison in 1983 is one of the most well-known in Europe, thanks to it at the time being considered escape-proof. This wasn't just any prison though. This maximum security pen located in Northern Ireland held many members of the IRA, Irish Republican Army, and men considered prisoners of war taken during the Northern Ireland conflict, which started in the late 60s, also known as the Troubles. IRA prisoners considered it their duty to escape from custody to continue their fight, and it was heavily encouraged in their culture, with there being numerous examples of it happening before this point, likely motivating the escapees in this case as well. But it was still going to be a dangerous and difficult feat. They didn't call it the maze for nothing. It had an incredibly complex layout, with multiple guard watchtowers, an advanced alarm system, and electronically controlled steel doors, surrounded by 15-foot fences and 18 feet tall concrete walls, crowned with barbed wire. The plan took months to conceive, as they had to study the security system and learn where the alarm could be triggered within the H7 block. From there they managed to smuggle in 6 handguns, which they used to simultaneously disable the guards in the block without triggering an alarm. From here they simply waited for a lorry, a truck carrying food supplies, to come to H7 and took the driver hostage, telling him they would kill him if he didn't drive them out of the prison. And if you can believe it, 37 IRA prisoners got on the back of the truck and they drove off. From here, 10 prisoners got out of the truck once they got to the main gate, and using disguises taken from the guards in H7, were able to take over the gatehouse and subdue the officers there. Although one did manage to press the alarm, but after threatening to kill the officer if he didn't comply, he told the responding officers over the intercom that it was actually just a false alarm. Another guard was stabbed as he attempted to raise the alarm elsewhere. At this point they had managed to open the gate and were on their way to freedom when a guard somewhere else in the prison managed to trigger the alarm, but by this point it was already too late to stop them. 35 prisoners were able to jump the fence and get out of the prison perimeter, making it one of the biggest breakouts in British history. Many guards were injured during the escape, and one even died of a heart attack after he was stabbed. As for the escapees, 15 were caught the same day, and eventually, all but 2 were arrested. Glenn Stewart Godwin. Here we have one of the only people on this list to have escaped prison and wasn't caught or ever seen again afterwards. Glenn Stewart Godwin, while living in California in 1980, planned with his friend, Frank Soto Jr., to rob their other acquaintance, a pilot and known drug dealer Kim Robert LaValle. They lured the man to their condo, beat and stabbed him to death before blowing up his body with explosives in the desert, which were discovered and identified as the remains of their friend, pointing the finger directly at them. Godwin was charged with the first-degree murder and received a 26-year to life sentence in 1983. He was taken to Dual Vocational Institute, a state prison in California, where he attempted his first escape in 1987, which failed and got him transferred to Folsom State, a maximum security prison and much harder to break out of. Likely through his wife and connections with a former cellmate, he was able to smuggle in a hacksaw and other tools which were used in June of that year to cut through the prison fence and escape through a storm drain, crawling almost half a mile in pitch blackness to reach the American River, where it is believed that a raft was waiting for him to float further down the river. While both his wife and former cellmate were both arrested for their aid in the escape, Godwin was still on the run, fleeing to Mexico to avoid prosecution, where apparently he became involved with drug cartels, being arrested in Mexico for drug trafficking charges and being sentenced to 7 years at Puente Grande Prison in 1991, one of the jails that El Chapo famously escaped from. Luckily for him, or unluckily maybe, his extradition to America was delayed after he killed another inmate and a member of a drug cartel, which may have been done to give him extra time to escape. Either way, it worked out, as he was able to break out in September of 1991 and has not been seen since. In 1996, he was added to the FBI's top 10 most wanted list, before being removed in May of 2016, despite him still being missing. He was said to still be involved with drug cartels, possibly operating under an alias of some kind, although to be honest, I doubt he is alive at this point. He was most likely killed and disappeared by rival drug cartels. If he is alive today, somewhere out there, he would be 67 years old. Michel Vaujour. Here we have another fascinating helicopter escape. To be honest, before I started researching for this video, I had no idea how popular of a method this was for breakouts. Anyways, one of the most notable of these cases, and most infamous in French history, was of a bank robber named Michel Vaujour. In 1986, he was serving 28 years for armed robbery, and had made 3 different failed escape attempts by this point, and was desperate for any way out. He enlisted the help of his wife Nadine to take pilot lessons and learn how to fly a helicopter, and apparently just rented one the day of the escape, which is wild that that was even allowed. You can't just do that anymore, right? Anyway, she did play her part, taking the chopper and flying low over the roof, and Michel did his job, making a fake pistol out of soap and black paint, and even painted nectarines to look like grenades, which he used to threaten the guards and make his way to the roof where his wife picked him up. They dropped the helicopter off at a football field and fled in a less conspicuous getaway car that was waiting for them. Seemed like the perfect plan, except it wasn't, and they were both arrested the same year, ending with Michel being shot in the head, but actually surviving. Michel attempted another similar helicopter escape with a different set of accomplices that hijacked a helicopter and forced the pilot to fly to the prison while his family was held hostage, although the pilot's wife had alerted authorities and they shut down the prison, effectively ending this escape attempt. And all this is without even mentioning that he has allegedly also broken out of other jails 4 different times. Casey White. This is probably going to be the most recent case on this list, taking place on April 29th, 2022. Casey White was doing 75 years for attempted murder and armed robbery at William E. Donaldson Correctional Facility, when he also confessed to the murder of 59-year-old Alabama resident Connie Ridgway, which got him 2 counts of capital murder. He was potentially looking at death row, despite recanting his original statement and pleading insanity. He was taken to Lauderdale County Jail to face trial for the murder, which is where he planned his escape. It was at this jail that he met Vicky White, no relation to the prisoner, and was an assistant director of corrections at the detention center. She was a model employee and was going to retire soon, but somehow the two became romantically involved, and she helped him escape on April 29th, 2022, the day of her planned retirement. She escorted him out of the jail and into her car, as she stated he was scheduled for a mental health evaluation at the courthouse that afternoon. Other officers found this suspicious, but didn't report it due to her status at the prison, but it was odd, as usually 2 guards are required to escort a prisoner to the courthouse, especially someone as dangerous as Casey White, with a history of violence and a stature of 6'9". The 2 never made it to the courthouse and never returned to the detention center, prompting a manhunt for both of them. The truck used in the getaway was found abandoned in Tennessee, and they made their way to Evansville, Indiana, where they stayed at a motel. Authorities were alerted to their presence, and a car chase ensued, with their truck flipping over after being rammed by a police vehicle. Inside the car, Vicky was found dead from a gunshot to the head, with Casey claiming that she had shot herself. Her death was ruled a suicide. Despite this, he was charged with first-degree murder of Vicky White because of the rule of felony murder, in which if a person is killed while committing a crime, then co-conspirators can be held accountable, but the charges were dropped in 2023 when White pleaded guilty to the prison escape. Despite only happening a few years ago, multiple movies and documentaries have been made about the relationship between Vicky and Casey, as well as the breakout and subsequent manhunt that ensued. Choi Gap Bok. The king of yoga, before he got his nickname, was a burglar who, along with 3 accomplices, broke into a jewelry store from the roof and stole 13 million won worth of gems and precious metals in 1990, which sounds like a lot more than it actually is. When you factor in inflation and conversion to USD, it's only something like $28,000 at the time, or closer to $70K today. But this was far from his first rodeo. He was an experienced robber by this point. This was just the first time he was caught. He had stolen over 100 million won from 13 different locations before he was arrested on July 25th. While being transported to Daegu prison in South Korea, in the middle of a traffic jam, he took the opportunity to escape the van by prying open loose metal bars and squeezing through a small gap. a trend which he will later become very associated with. He was only gone for a short while as he was recaptured and taken to Daegu prison on August 2nd, where he served out his time before being released. From here he would only commit worse offenses, including the sexual assault of a middle school student in 2008, which he only did an additional 4 years for, from 2008 to 2012. After having been released for this offense, he was arrested again not long after for attempting to break into his landlord's house, and he was once again being hauled off to Daegu, but this time was placed in a temporary holding cell of a police station. On his 5th day of incarceration, on September 17, 2012, Choi acquired lotion and covered his body in it, allowing him to barely squeeze through the cell door food slot, sneaking past officers on duty and out of a small window. Choi is only 5'4", but it is still quite a feat to be able to squeeze through the slot, which was only about 6 inches tall and 18 inches wide. Like most escapees though, they don't really know what to do once they get out, or at least they aren't that good at staying hidden, as he was caught once again after just 6 days on the run. Ronaldo Silva. Definitely one of the more unique approaches to escape jail comes from Brazilian gang leader Ronaldo Silva, aka Shorty, who managed to escape from Pinedo jail by dressing up as his 19-year-old daughter, donning a wig, a face mask, and female clothing. Ronaldo was a drug trafficker doing 75 years, so he figured his only chance of ever seeing the outside world was through breaking out, but his approach was far from conventional, calling on his pregnant wife to smuggle in the disguise because she would not be subjected to searches or the metal detector. He was at the very least able to fool the guards enough to almost walk out of the prison, but didn't get very far beyond that, as a guard noticed a suspicious individual flailing around in high heels trying to leave. Ronaldo was found out before he could even really escape, but hey, he got out of the jail and it's an interesting story, so we're including it. He was just as quickly hauled back in and given an additional 25 years to his already daunting sentence. Alabama peanut butter escape. And if you thought that was weird, then how about the Alabama peanut butter escape? 12 inmates at Walker County Jail in Alabama concocted an insane yet kind of ingenious and relatively simple method of escaping. They used peanut butter to obscure the numbers on an exit door and tricked a new guard into opening it, allowing them to sprint outside and jump the fence, using their jumpsuits to cover the barbed wire, and that was it. Simple as that. Still, it didn't take long for all of the 12 inmates to be recaptured. The last to be caught was Brady Kilpatrick, who was the only one to make it out of the county before being arrested. Redouane Faïd. Redouane Faïd is a French criminal of Algerian immigrants born in 1972 and ended up being declared France's most wanted criminal in 2013. But how did this happen? Well, he had quite a storied criminal career dating back to the mid-90s. He and a friend led a gang of armed robbers responsible for stealing jewelry and even holding up an armored truck. Most of the gang was arrested, but he fled to Switzerland and Palestine before being captured himself in 1998. He received a 30-year sentence, but only served 10 before being released on parole. After this, he sort of became a French celebrity, going on talk shows and having interviews after writing a book about his life of crime in 2009 and how he had turned over a new leaf. This did not turn out to be the case though, as just a few years later, he was arrested after violating his parole and was suspected of being involved in a heist which left an officer of the law dead. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison, and this is where his series of escapes would begin. In April of 2013, he was being held at Sequedin prison in northern France and was able to escape with the help of co-conspirators, using explosives to blow open the doors of the prison and take the guards hostage while they escaped in a getaway car. He would be arrested a little over a month later, on May 29, 2013, staying at a hotel and attempting to forge documents to get him into Israel to stay on the run as he previously did. He was later taken to a prison in Rho, which he once again managed to escape from with the help of accomplices and a helicopter in June of 2018. A flying instructor was once again kidnapped, and forced to fly a helicopter from an airport nearby and pick up Faid from the prison courtyard after the other accomplices had busted through the doors using an angle grinder. Once again, however, Faid was not able to successfully flee France, as he was arrested on October 3, 2018, in Creil, where he was born. He, along with family members and criminal conspirators, were convicted in this latest breakout, and he received another 14 years to his term. Jack Shepherd. This is definitely going to be the oldest case on this list, so a lot of the information on this guy can't be as easily verified. We're talking about the original prison escape artist, John Shepherd, known as Honest Jack, a thief born into a poor family in 18th century England. He started out as a carpenter, but slowly began to engage in criminal activity like shoplifting and theft to support his meager wages, and learned to become quite good at his craft, leading him to join the company of a gang. His first run-in with the law would come on February 5th, 1724, when he was arrested and imprisoned at St. Giles' Roundhouse in London, which he escaped from in only 3 hours by breaking through the wooden ceiling and lowering himself down to the ground, using a rope tied with bed sheets. That May, he was arrested again for pickpocketing and taken to St. Anne's Roundhouse in Soho. His wife Lynne visited him and was also thrown in jail with him. From there, they were transferred to a prison called the New Prison, located in Clerkenwell, which they both escaped from just a few days later using the same method, filing through their handcuffs, breaking off a bar in the window of their cell, and then descending to the ground using a makeshift rope made of bed sheets. And from there, they still had to scale a giant 22-foot gate out of the prison yard, which they still managed to do. Shepherd was arrested a third time in July of 1724 and was sentenced to death for his role in a burglary. Yeah, punishments were pretty intense back then, and unlike today, you did not sit on death row for years. He was convicted on August 12th, and his date of execution was set for September 4th. However, he managed to escape before this would happen on August 31st from Newgate Prison, thanks again to the help of his wife Lynne, who distracted the guards while he pried the iron bar from his cell door, which gave him a big enough gap for him to slip through. He then managed to dress in women's clothing which Lynne had taken with her, and he slipped out of the jail yet again. By this time, Shepherd had become a local legend, and somewhat of a hero to the people for his repeated escapes, but when he was arrested again on September 9th, the guards of Newgate knew they had to keep a close eye on him, and that a normal cell wouldn't be enough. They took him to a special part of Newgate Prison, known as the Castle, and he was chained to the floor of his cell and placed in leg irons as well as handcuffs, seemingly making a fourth escape impossible. But he was allegedly so confident still in his ability to escape that he taunted his jailers, showing them how he could undo his handcuffs, which led them to tightening his restraints even further. Shepherd still had luck on his side though, because his former gang leader, Jonathan Wild, who helped capture not only him, but also one of his friends, nicknamed Blueskin, was attacked by Blueskin in the middle of his trial, slicing open his throat with a pocket knife and causing panic and chaos within the district. Using this to his advantage, Jack unlocked his handcuffs as he demonstrated to the guards that he could easily do, but was still bound by his leg irons. He climbed up the chimney and broke through several rooms until he reached the prison chapel and then eventually the roof, which was 60 feet above ground. He didn't have a means to get down, so he had to climb all the way back down to his cell, grab his blanket, and climb all the way back up, and used it to get onto a neighboring roof. He then broke into the house, where he was able to simply walk down the stairs and onto the streets. He hid out for several days, with the leg irons still on, until he was able to convince a blacksmith that he had been wrongly imprisoned and helped him remove his restraints. From here, he continued his life of thievery until he was arrested for the final time on November 1st. Keep in mind, this all happened within a year. This, however, was the end of the line. He was watched at all times by multiple guards and was shackled with 300 pounds of iron. Even for Honest Jack, there was no way out of this one. He was still a celebrated hero. People begged for his pardon to the king. He was painted, his story was told by writers, and guards even charged people to visit his cell. His final chance to live was given on November 10th, when he was offered to have his sentence reduced if he gave up accomplices, which he refused to do, confirming his execution. On November 16th, he was hanged at the gallows in Tyburn. Although Jack hadn't given up just yet, he had numerous contingencies in place, all of which failed. First, he planned to cut himself down with a smuggled penknife, but this was discovered by a guard shortly before he was hanged. And also, his friends were in the crowd and attempted to recover his body, take it to a doctor, and somehow have him revived. This was never allowed to happen though, as the corpse was removed as soon as it was cut down, ending the legendary tale of Honest Jack. Omid Tavili. This here is yet another case of a man who was able to evade justice and disappeared shortly after his escape, never to be seen again. Omid and his family immigrated from Iran, coming to Canada in 1994. He ended up becoming the patriarch of an organized crime family, and post his escape was listed by Forbes as on the top 10 list for most wanted fugitives throughout the world. His first arrest in 2000 would result in a not guilty verdict for drug possession, and he was arrested again in 2005 for the kidnapping and sexual assault of an associate's brother-in-law in Canada, and for running a telemarketing scam business targeting people in the US, which resulted in him being ordered for extradition to the United States. While his lawyer was fighting against these proceedings, Omid managed to slip out of a maximum security facility, North Fraser Pretrial Center, in British Columbia. Camera footage from the 2007 escape shows a guard, Edwin Tickney, assisting Omid in his breakout, opening locked doors, with Omid being dressed as a janitor, all in exchange for a payout of $50,000. The guard was arrested the following year and sentenced to 3 years behind bars himself, but Omid managed to elude authorities and has not been seen since, despite being considered an international fugitive. Asada Shakur. Asada Shakur, born Joanne Deborah Byron, is a political activist and a member of the Black Liberation Army that was convicted back in 1977 of the murder of Werner Forster, a state trooper, in 1973. Prior to this, she was charged with other shootings, an armed robbery, and a kidnapping, and was given a life sentence to be served at Clinton Correctional Facility for Women in New Jersey. In 1979, she was broken out of the prison by 3 members of the BLA, who visited the jail and used concealed weapons to take the guards hostage and blow open the doors using dynamite, making their escape with a stolen van. After this, she was the subject of a nationwide manhunt by the FBI and law enforcement in the United States. She sought refuge from prosecution in Cuba, where the government refused to extradite her. She escaped prison 45 years ago, and since then has not been apprehended. In 2013, she became the only woman to be on the FBI's most wanted terrorist list. Kingman, Arizona State Prison. On July 30th, 2010, 3 inmates, all convicted of violent crimes, Tracy Allen Province, Daniel Kelly Renwick, and John Charles McCluskey, broke out of Kingman, Arizona State Prison, a medium security facility owned and operated by a government contractor, likely why the security was fairly lax at this prison and why such an escape was made possible. McCluskey's cousin, Caslin Welch, aided in the escape by driving the getaway vehicle behind the prison and simply throwing bolt cutters over the fence to the prisoners, which they used to cut through the fence to the Chevy Blazer waiting for them. At this point, the alarm was sounded, which the guards actually ignored at the time due to it constantly malfunctioning, and for some reason, Daniel Renwick stole the car and drove off on his own, leaving McCluskey, Welch, and Province to run away from the jail on foot, before eventually hijacking a semi-truck stopped alongside Interstate 40. Despite having a head start and abandoning his crew, Renwick was first arrested on August 1st, all the way in Colorado, after the suspicious vehicle was reported. Province was arrested on August 8th in Wyoming, and the last 2 were captured by a tactical response team in Arizona on August 19th. Renwick was given another 48 years for the attempted murder of a police officer during his arrest, while McCluskey, Welch, and Province were accused of carjacking a couple, Gary and Lindy Haas, and then killing them off of Interstate 40 during their escape. McCluskey was eventually convicted of the murder, thanks to testimony from both Welch and Province. He narrowly avoided a death sentence to his already ailing health and would pass away in 2017. Papillon. This world-famous escape is the subject of not only a memoir written by Henry Charrier, but also was adapted into a Hollywood film of the same name in 1973, and was remade as well in 2017, starring Charlie Hunnam as the man in question, Henry, whose nickname was Papillon, a French word meaning butterfly. Though his book is considered a factual retelling of his life, some of it may be exaggerated, and some scholars even believe some of the stories were taken from other inmates he knew, rather than just himself. But regardless, the story begins when, in October of 1931, Henry is convicted of the murder of a pimp, which he claims vehemently that he did not commit. He was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor on top of a life sentence, and was sent to a penal colony in French Guiana. He made his first escape in November of 1933, alongside 2 other prisoners, before being detained again while on the run by police in Colombia. He allegedly then escaped from his confinement there to the Guajira Peninsula in northern Colombia, where he integrated into a tribe of natives, living with them for months before eventually moving on and being captured by French authorities not long after. Because of his escape, he was forced into 2 years of solitary before returning to prison, where he would attempt and fail to escape numerous times, getting him sent eventually to a notorious labor camp known as Devil's Island, also known as the penal colony of Cayenne. This is where his most famous escape would happen, on a secluded island, possibly even more difficult to flee than even Alcatraz, thanks to the strong currents, sheer distance from civilization, and shark-infested waters. But after noticing that coconuts falling from trees and thrown into the sea would drift from the island, he came up with an idea, alongside another prisoner. They would create a makeshift raft out of coconuts tied together with a net to hopefully float back to the mainland and away from the camp. They rowed the tide out to sea on a stormy night to hopefully move a greater distance and also disguise their escape, which worked, although his companion also perished on the journey. Eventually he would reach Venezuela, where he was again arrested and sent to another penal colony in the state of Bolivar, where after doing a year there, would finally be released and granted citizenship in Venezuela in 1944, making him now a free man. He would go on to write his famous memoir and publish his book in 1969, and would even be pardoned the following year for the murder he was alleged to have committed, but would pass away only 3 years later in Spain. Vasilis Pelayo Costa. Known by the nickname the Greek Robin Hood, this guy was also known for escaping via helicopter. I guess it really isn't as unique of a tactic as I thought it was when I first started making this video. Seems kinda like the go-to option outside of the US at least. Anyways, he and his brother Nikos were both prolific bank robbers. His brother had been sentenced to 197 years for 16 robberies, and Vasilis was known as Robin Hood thanks to him allegedly giving most of the money he stole to the poor. He also dabbled in a little kidnapping, and he was arrested in 2000 and sentenced to 25 years for kidnapping the CEO of Greek food company Haitoglu Bros. Vasilis would escape from Korydallos prison on June 4th, 2006, with the help of 2 accomplices, who scheduled a sightseeing helicopter tour in Athens and then hijacked it with a pistol and a grenade, forcing the pilot to land near the prison and pick up Vasilis. Prison guards were completely oblivious, thinking the helicopter was just a visit from inspectors. This didn't matter too much though, as he would be captured 2 years later in August of 2008. However, this was their last chance, as after this next escape, he vanished without a trace. For some reason, he was placed in the same prison and escaped yet again with the use of a helicopter in February of 2009, which again was hijacked and flown over the courtyard where he and his cellmate Alket Rizai could climb a rope ladder and escape. The men were then dropped off at a getaway car, and that was the last time Vasilis was ever seen, although his cellmate Alket Rizai was arrested that same year in November. Colditz Castle. Here we have another wartime camp, which was infamous in World War II, known as O-Flag 4C, located in Colditz Castle, Germany. It was the subject of so many failed escape attempts, it became one of the most fabled prisoner of war camps in all of the Second World War. They created copies of keys, drew maps, attempted to forge documentation, and even received supplies from MI9, who actually had a department dedicated to creating escape equipment for soldiers stuck in these particular circumstances, which were smuggled into the camp, and yet still nothing was working. Prisoners tried to impersonate guards and even officers, dressed in drag and as electricians, but these disguises would fail most of the time. Many tunnels were discovered before completion, and even clay heads were used to try and mask when someone was away trying to break out, but all of these attempts were pretty much fruitless. Some tried to descend with ropes before being caught, and others even tried to create a makeshift glider to fly out of the camp, a la Mob of the Dead. A German officer even kept an escape museum of all the failed attempts of fleeing the camp. There were as many as 300 escape attempts, and only around 30 were successes, only 16 of which came from within the castle itself. Some of these included things that had previously failed, such as a British Army officer, Ari Neve, who escaped by forging documents and disguising himself as a German soldier. Another British officer, Pat Reed, would escape via a tunnel with 3 others, and an unnamed French officer even escaped hidden inside of a Red Cross crate marked for shipment. Richard Lee McNair. Richard Lee McNair is yet another criminal known for his propensity and ability to escape. In 1987, he was a U.S. Air Force sergeant stationed in Minot, North Dakota, and on November 17, 1987, for reasons unknown, attempted to burglarize a Farmers Union grain elevator when he was surprised by 2 men and shot them both, killing Jerry Thies and injuring Richard Kitzman. McNair wouldn't be a suspect until the next year, when he was taken in for questioning to the local police station, which was his first escape, before he was even arrested or formally charged. He was found just a few hours later and handcuffed to a chair and watched by 3 detectives. At some point, they stopped watching him, thinking he wouldn't be able to escape again thanks to his handcuffs, but thanks to not being searched, he used lip balm which was in his pocket to grease his hands enough to free them from the cuffs, and from there would lead the police on a foot chase through the town. It was quite dramatic, running through buildings, upstairs and onto a rooftop where he jumped to a tree branch in an attempt to get away, but the branch broke and McNair fell to the ground, injuring himself to the point that he could not continue his flight. This was all before even being taken to a jail cell. From here he was taken to the local Ward County Jail, where another attempt was foiled, as guards noticed 2 cinder blocks in his cell had been partially chiseled out of the wall. After this, he was convicted of the murder and attempted murder and given 2 life sentences to be served at North Dakota State Penitentiary in Bismarck. His next breakout would come on October 9th, 1992, when he and 2 other inmates would escape by crawling through a ventilation shaft, a rather simple method, but it worked. His co-conspirators were arrested shortly after, but McNair remained on the lam for 10 months, becoming a nomad, roaming the United States, stealing cars, and never staying in one place, even growing out his hair and dyeing it blonde to disguise himself. This didn't work out as he was apprehended in Nebraska in July of 1993. Following this, it was clear that McNair was not an ordinary inmate, and thus should be moved to a much harder to escape facility, which he was. Minnesota Correctional Facility, Oak Park Heights. In fact, it was so impossible to escape that his best chance of seeing the outside world wasn't to try and break out of the place, but instead participate in a strike which would finally get him moved years later to another maximum security prison, Florence High Penitentiary in Colorado. This was just as bad, if not worse, thanks to its proximity to ADX Florence, the highest security prison in the entire country. So he complained again and was transferred to USP Pollock, which he argued was necessary as it was closer to where his parents lived in Oklahoma, but in reality was just an easier target in his mind, being still high security but not maximum security, improving his chances greatly. This plan worked as he was able to escape on April 5th, 2006. He worked in a carpentry area inside the prison and was in charge of repairing mail bags, which he used to create a sort of pod that he could fit inside, complete with a tube for getting oxygen while inside. He would sit inside of this pod and wait for it to be taken via forklift to a different unguarded warehouse outside the prison, which he could then free himself from and simply walk out to freedom. This was all done before lunchtime at about 11 a.m., and he figured the alarm wouldn't be triggered until the 4 o'clock count, meaning he had a huge head start that most escapees do not have, and was going to use it to steal a vehicle and get out of town. This next part might have been the most impressive part of the whole thing, and was documented on a police car camera and has since garnered over 42 million views, as McNair is questioned by a police officer and manages to convince him that he's a jogger, seemingly unbothered, joking with the man and appearing quite calm. After giving the officer his name and chatting with him for 10 minutes, he was again on his way.
What is? We got an escapee.
Oh, shit. Where from?
Prison.
There's a prison here?
Yeah.
Huh.
Against all odds, McNair managed to get away, vanishing into Canada and being added to the US Marshals top 15 wanted list. He evaded both Canadian and American police, at multiple points even getting into a chase with the RCMP, all the while being featured in an episode of America's Most Wanted. McNair was finally apprehended after a year on the run in British Columbia, and was transferred to a maximum security prison in New Brunswick, before being extradited back to the US and transferring between multiple maximum security prisons, including ADX Florence, but is currently incarcerated at USP McCreary in Kentucky. TJ Lane. TJ Lane III is one of the most reprehensible people on this list to have escaped custody, being responsible for the 2012 Chardon High School shooting on February 27, 2012, which ended the lives of 3 students and injured 3 others. The then 17-year-old was arrested by police after his violent spree by his car parked outside the school. He was tried in court as an adult and received 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He was sent to Allen Correctional Institution in Lima, Ohio to serve out his sentence. However, on the night of September 11, 2014, he and 2 other inmates broke out of the prison using a makeshift ladder they had created to scale the fence during the rec hours in the yard. One of these suspects was caught not long after, Lindsay Bruce. However, TJ Lane and the other prisoner, Clifford Opperud, had evaded authorities, at least until the following day, as Lane was apprehended in the nearby woods at 1:20 a.m. and Opperud was found a few hours later. The 3 were sent to a supermax prison called Ohio State Penitentiary, but Lane was later moved to a maximum security facility in southern Ohio. Mark DeFriest. Known by the nickname of the Houdini of Florida, this man is one of America's most successful prison escape artists, allegedly having done so 7 times over the course of his criminal career. Funnily enough, unlike most prisoners who seek freedom by escape, Mark wasn't convicted of a violent crime and didn't receive a harsh sentence at all in the grand scheme of things. It's not like he was doing 30 years. He was sentenced to 4 in 1980 for violating his probation. And I guess he really didn't want to go back inside, as his sentence would be extended numerous times after many escape attempts. 13 in fact, some successful, some not, which, along with some other infractions, extended his stay in prison from 4 years to 34, with 27 spent in solitary confinement After becoming quite famous due to his exploits, he was granted parole in February of 2019, and a documentary about his life was even created in 2014 called The Mind of Mark DeFriest. His first known successful escape would come at Florida State Hospital by somehow getting his hands on LSD and putting it into the staff's coffee pot, although he was found out by security and had to make a break for it, getting over the fence and stealing a car before being arrested again and sent to Bay County Jail. He also managed another getaway by producing a mock-up of his cell key based on simply observing them on guards' belts. He even made an escape by pulling his own tooth out to be sent to the prison dentist, where he then made an improvised zip gun using toothpaste and items from the workshop. Mark also possibly suffered from undiagnosed mental illnesses and was also the subject of abuse during his stay in Florida prisons, even witnessing the death of another inmate at the hands of guards, to which he was sent to another facility for his own protection. John Patrick Hannon. John Patrick Hannon holds the record as the escapee with the longest escape from custody ever recorded, having escaped from the British HM prison the Verne back in December of 1955 when he was just 22 years old, meaning since then he's been missing for almost 70 years and was not again discovered. John was born in Ireland in 1933 and was arrested in 55 for stealing a car and assaulting 2 police officers, for which he was sentenced to 21 months of prison at the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court of England and Wales, located in London, which has been around. The building was attached to Newgate Prison, where, if you recall, Jack Shepherd was imprisoned back in 1724. He didn't plan on staying long though, despite his relatively short sentence, as he was there only about a month and escaped along with his friend, Gwyneth Thomas, on December 22nd, 1955. They simply used the tried and true tactic of making a rope out of bed sheets and climbed over the wall of the prison and followed some train tracks to the mainland of the Isle of Portland where the prison was located. Thomas was arrested just 16 hours after the escape in Dorchester, but it's believed that Hannon fled to his home country of Ireland, where he either died or still lives today, although he would be 92 as of making this video.